Hi everyone, and welcome to this series of macroeconomics podcasts. Today we're going to explore the accounting framework behind a model that we're going to use throughout the semester. The model is a simplified representation of the economy in which we do not consider all the agents and all the goods individually, but as aggregates, meaning that we group agents and goods into categories that we assume are homogeneous. This is a strong assumption, but necessary, as it would be impossible to represent the entire economy, taking into account the specificities of all the agents and all the goods. We consider four representative economic agents: the firms, which are the producers; the households, which are consumers but also workers; the state, and the central bank. Later on, we will actually merge the state and the central bank into one single agent. We will consider four categories of goods: the product Y, which includes all products, services, public goods, etc. Labor, noted N. Currency, or money, noted M, as well as bonds, noted B. It's a monetary economy, so we have three monetary prices: the price of the product, or the general level of prices, noted P; the price of labor, or nominal wage, noted W; and the nominal interest rate, noted R, which matters both for the money market and for the goods market. Note that lowercase letters designate real variables, while uppercase letters designate nominal variables. A consistent accounting framework implies that at each period, the agents finance their expenses and comply with their budget constraints. The budget constraint therefore expresses the equality in real terms between the resources and expenses of an agent. After defining the budget constraints of each of the four agents, we will be able to gather them together to represent the circular economy, in which one agent's expense is necessarily a resource for another agent. Let's start with the firm's budget constraints. Their supply are obtained through production and through borrowing, which means in our model by issuing new bonds. The issue of new bonds is expressed by the difference between bonds held at the end of the period, BF, and bonds held at the beginning of the period, B0F, hence delta BF. Regarding their uses, the firms pay the households different types of income, the wages, dividends, and interests on bonds already issued. Firms also invest. Basically, the firms pay all their revenues to the households unless they keep a share of it for self-financing purposes. We can then simplify the budget constraints, simplifying each side by Y, obtaining delta BF over P equals I minus A. Note again that I and A are real variables, so we need to divide by P on the left to ensure equality. If the firms do not self-finance, the constraint then means that to finance its investment, the firm needs to borrow the same amount from households in the form of bonds. If we draft the periodic sequence of the firms, we can clearly see the simplifications that we have here from the reality. For instance, the firms don't pay a corporate tax and are not subject to social contributions. Anyway, the added value created by the production is distributed in the form of wages, dividends, and interest to the households, and the gross savings that are left, if any, allow to self-finance the investment. The balance of the capital account, the last non-financial account, shows the financing capacity or financing need of the agent. Usually, firms will express a financing need. The financial account will then enable to understand how the financing need will actually be financed. In our case, the firms will finance their investment by issuing new bonds. We see here the articulation between financial and non-financial accounts, because the financing need is necessarily equal to the financial balance, as each agent has to finance its own activities. Now let's look at a household's budget constraint. In supply, households get the income that is distributed by the firms, Y, minus the self-financing, if any. Besides, households can also hold bonds issued by the state in the past, so they can receive an interest on these bonds. On the user side, households spend their income on consumption and they pay taxes. With the savings left after taxes, they can buy new bonds. Again, this will be expressed by the difference between the stock of bonds at the end of the period and the stock of bonds at the beginning of the period. These bonds can be purchased from firms, but also from the state. After that, households may still have some money left. This amount of money, M, or currency, will be available to the household at the beginning of the next period. Note that we can express taxes net of the interest paid to the households. What that means is that basically we have two flows. On one hand, households pay taxes to the state, and on the other hand, the state pays interests to households. So we can simplify that by expressing only one flow, T, which expresses the actual net amount that the state collects from the households. In this simplified constraint that you see here, we can clearly see the disposable income of households, their income after tax, available for consumption or savings. The savings can be detained as bonds or as currency. The periodic sequence of households shows the primary income of households, wages, dividends, interests, and the taxes that they pay as part of secondary distribution. Then they use their disposable income to consume, and what's left is saved. At the end of the non-financial accounts, usually households will have a financing capacity. The financial accounts will then show how this financing capacity can be used to increase the financial assets of households. In our model, we have two financial assets: bonds, which can be purchased from firms or the state, and money, or currency. Again, we see here the articulation between the financing capacity and the financial balance. Let's look at the state now. Let's first consider that the state and the central bank are two different agents. For the state, we have on the user side public spending, as well as interest payments to those who lended money to the state in the past through bonds. Two agents can lend money to the state: households and the central bank. We will assume that the interest paid by the state to the central bank is then redistributed to the state. We therefore find them in the supply as well, where we will also find taxes that the state collects from households. In supply, the state can also issue new bonds purchased by households or by the central bank. In terms of notation, we write B to the power capital G when the bonds are issued by the state, capital C when the bonds are purchased by the central bank, and small g when the bonds are purchased by households. Using the expression for the net taxes that we used for households, the simplified budget constraint of the state appears. Public spending G can be financed by taxes T or by borrowing, delta BG over P. Let's have a look at the periodic sequence. We suppose here that the state does not have any public officers, so there are no wages. Hence, in the primary income account, we'll find the payment of interest, and we'll find the taxes collected in the secondary distribution account. The state uses its supply to finance public spending. Usually, these supply are not enough, and we end up with a financing need, or a public deficit, G minus T. This will result in the state issuing new bonds. These new bonds can be purchased by households or by the central bank. Again, in the periodic sequence of the state, we see the articulation between the financing need and the financial balance. The budget constraint of the central bank has the following elements. It receives interests from the state on the bonds purchased, and it redistributes back these interests to the state. So we have these interests both in uses and in supply. We can therefore simplify this constraint to only show the money created in supply and in uses the new bonds purchased from the state. We clearly see here the role of the central bank in terms of money creation. The central bank increases reserves through open market operations. It purchases public debt securities from the state, which increases the money supply in the economy. Of course, here we assume that there are no commercial banks. This means that an increase of central money, reserves, directly increases the money supply. Looking at the periodic sequence of the central bank, we see that the interest received from the state and redistributed appear in the primary income account. The sequence shows the financial role of the central bank through open market operations. Again, we see the articulation between non-financial and financial accounts. In practice, it makes sense to aggregate the constraints of the state and the central bank. Today, it is true that most central banks of developed economies are independent, but historically, it has not always been the case. The French central bank, for instance, only became independent in 1993. When we aggregate the two constraints, we no longer see the flows of income circulating between the two agents. It's as if the state was directly creating money and able to finance its own expenses. Similarly, the bonds purchased by the central bank no longer appear. Only the bonds purchased by the households remain. If we write taxes as taxes net of interest payment as we did earlier, we can rewrite the budget constraint in the following way, which shows us that the state can finance its public spending using three instruments: money creation, the printing press; borrowing, issuing new bonds that will be purchased by households; and taxes. We can finally represent our modelized economy using the TIEA. If you remember from your classes of national accounting last year, in columns we have the 4 agents plus 1 goods and services column that allows to balance uses and supply. In line, we read the operations and the flows between agents. In the TIEA, there should be a balance line by line. Overall, in our closed economy, there should be a compensation between the non-financial balances of the different agents. Households in financing capacity will finance the financing needs of the state. The financial account then shows the forms that takes this compensation, money or bonds.